Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, The Story Ain't Over. So today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in July, and I honestly had a pretty successful reading month. I got through 6 books this month, which I haven't done in a while, so very proud of myself. I have a really interesting mix of books to talk about today, so let's just jump right in. The first book that I have is The Goth House Experiment and Other Stories by S.J. Sindhu. This is actually an advanced reader copy that the publisher Soho sent to me early, and I am so glad they sent this to me because I freaking loved this collection. This book actually comes out in October of this year, so definitely watch out for it. But honestly, I'm not much of a short story reader. I have always struggled to get through short story collections. I always find that I start to lose interest, and I just find that I need a consistent full story to take me fully through the book. But for some reason, these stories just gripped me like no others have. And honestly, it's just a testament to S.J. Sindhu as a writer. I personally love her previous books, so Marriage of a Thousand Lies, which I've talked about extensively as a representation of queerness that I have just never seen before and just really felt familiar to me. And then she's also written Blue Skin Gods, which we read for the Read and Color book club before, and also absolutely loved that one. It just had so many interesting themes to it and asked so many incredible questions. So when I was going into this book, I knew that like S.J. Sindhu is a great writer and that hopefully these stories would touch on some similar topics, and boy was I like in for a ride, because I think there's about 5 or 6 short stories in this book, and I personally really loved the first 2 the most. The others were also great, but the first 2, which were Dark Academia and the Lesbian Master Doc, and then Patriots Day, those 2 stories were just so interesting and just gripping to me. Like, I was so hooked and I needed to know what was gonna happen next. And honestly, I kind of wish that both were like longer stories or longer novellas or novels, because they were just so interesting, especially the first one, the Dark Academia and Lesbian Master Doc. I feel like that could have been a whole entire novel and I would have been so freaking hooked. But yeah, overall, this was just a really incredibly written and fascinating collection of stories, and they span between contemporary themes and also speculative elements. So the first 3 I think were more contemporary, and then the later 2 or 3 were more on the speculative side. They had more like fantastical elements to them, whether they were like fantasy or sci-fi or just like magical realism. So if you are someone who has similar reading taste to me, if you love books with queer POC characters, because almost every single one of the stories had either POC characters or queer characters or the combination of the 2, and I just really loved seeing that representation as just like a very regular part of the story, and I think that was particularly like focused on in a big way. Like, the stories were still about these other really big themes, but the queerness and the like characters of color were just like the norm, and I love that. I really do feel like the later few stories will be really fun to read for Halloween later this year, but the earlier stories will also just be really great for just any time of the year, but they do kind of feel more like fall-ish. So yeah, really excited for this to come out later this fall and can't wait to see what all of you think of it. In terms of a quote that I really loved from this one, I picked out just one in particular, which is from the story Patriots Day, and it goes, "The only thing he really understood at the end of it all was the real tragedy of immigration, that it made parents and children strangers to one another, created a cultural gap too wide to fill. If you stayed on one side, you'll always yearn for the other. If you try to straddle the abyss, you'll fail." I really love that quote because in that particular story, Patriots Day, it really talks about like the American dream and sort of immigration, and it was just such a fascinating story that touched on so many different themes, and I really felt for the characters, I think, because there were several different ones and they come from different walks of life, and you just really feel for them, I think. But that was actually the one story that was like the least queer, and all the rest of them were like super gay, and I love that as well, so just like keep that in mind. I just couldn't find a specific quote from each of those to like read out to you guys, but yeah, overall, all the stories were fantastic. Highly recommend The Goth House Experiment and Other Stories by S.J. Sindhu. I would give this one a 4.5 stars. I loved it. Alrighty, the next book that I read in July is one that I've actually been nursing for a few months, and I finally finished in July. And the reason I was sort of taking so long to finish it was because I just needed to stop every now and then while reading it because it was just hitting me so freaking hard. So that book was Haldol and Hyacinths, A Bipolar Life by Melody Mosey. So Melody Mosey is Iranian American, and she is a writer, is in politics, I think, has done a lot of speaking things, and this book is her memoir and her talking about her experience with having bipolar disorder and how that's affected her life and just like the different aspects of her life and how that all sort of plays into her bipolar life. And it was such a fascinating read for me, and this honestly goes up there for me with An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison, which was another book about bipolar disorder that really freaking hit me hard. I just related so much to so many of the things that Melody Mosey talks about in her memoir, and I just really loved how honest she was with this memoir. She really doesn't pull back from portraying how sort of awful she could be with this illness, and how it wasn't easy for her family or for her partner or for her. And there was just all these different aspects to her story and her experience with bipolar disorder that was just so fascinating to read about. I really loved hearing her talk about the support that her family and her partner had for her and how they really cared for her. There was just some really beautiful moments. Like there's even a moment where she's like telling her partner that, you know, this is your moment, you can take an out if you want to. Like, I'm starting to realize how awful this illness can be, so this is your moment, like you can leave if you want. And he just like sits there and he's like, no, I knew you were crazy from the start, like I'm here for you, I'm gonna, you know, be with you to the end. And I just loved sort of seeing that. It was really beautiful, and all the moments with her family, her sister, her parents, and how close she was with all of them was just really beautiful to see. Obviously Melody Mosey has a level of privilege that some people, you know, wouldn't have who might have this disorder, and so that was an aspect that I was kind of like keeping in mind as I was reading this, because she came from a relatively wealthy household, but I think she's aware of her privilege and how her circumstances were quite different from other people. One of the things I found interesting was how she sort of talks about her life as being sort of divided into, you know, her Iranian American identity and then having her bipolar disorder and having these manic and depressive episodes, these manic and depressive selves. And she particularly has bipolar disorder 1, so she definitely has a lot more manic episodes and psychotic episodes, which were honestly just really chilling and scary to read about at some points in the book, because I mean, on my end, it was just like the idea that, you know, this might be a future possibility for me, that, you know, I could end up in these situations, but it was also just like scary to think about in the sense of like knowing that your mind could betray you in such a dramatic way is just kind of scary to think about. And, you know, the fact that she was able to write about all of this was just so incredible, and like I admire her courage to do that. One thing that she did mention in the book is how bipolar disorder is actually classified as the 6th leading cause of disability by the World Health Organization. And when I read that line, I was just like kind of astounded, and sort of it broke this perception in my head that disability was like only physical disability. And I think a lot of us sort of think that way, but living with mental illness and, you know, mental disorders can cause like disability. And I was just thinking about it in my own life, how like it's harder for me to like get up and go to work in the morning because I don't know how I'm gonna wake up, what sort of state I'm gonna wake up in, and if that's gonna affect my ability to deal with everything throughout the day. That's not something that you typically want to like give as an excuse. Like when you're sick with a cold, it's really easy to just call into your boss and say, you know, I'm sick with a cold. But when your mind has betrayed you for the day, it's kind of hard to just like come out and like say that to your boss or someone or anyone, because it just feels like not a real thing because it's all in your head. And it's also been this situation where even when I've casually told people about my mental illness, it's sort of dismissed as like I'm just joking, or I'm just using it as like hyperbole, you know, when people say, you know, my ADHD or whatever, but they really don't have ADHD. And it's just kind of frustrating for me as someone with like ADHD and bipolar now that I know these things, to like, you know, say these things to people trying to explain why I am the way I am in a particular moment or a day, and have them sort of dismiss it because of the way that we have started to use, you know, these words as descriptors and hyperbole for, you know, regular things. So yeah, I think I was just thinking about a lot of things while reading this book, and it was honestly just a really hard-hitting book, and I highly recommend it to any of you, whether you have like a mental illness or not. I think it's just really fascinating to learn more about this illness and also just her experience with it. And I think she also talks a lot about, you know, her experience being Iranian American and seeing the political situation in Iran as, you know, she was growing up in the States, and, you know, her talking about the healthcare system and the way that we treat mental illness was just really interesting as well. And I think she makes some really great arguments, and I just loved reading about all of that. One of the things I really loved that she talked about was how she's had like a lot of accomplishments in her life. You know, she's a very accomplished person. She's written books, she's done speaking things, but she was talking about how when she was going through recovery and in like a treatment facility for mental illness, she felt so proud of her achievement at like being a year through like her treatment, achievement and being in a much better place than she was, you know, a year previously, and that achievement felt even more grand than all of her accolades before that. And I think that was just something I really vibed with, because despite everything that I've been able to do, regaining control of my mind and understanding my mind has been the biggest achievement to me. Like, I can't imagine something feeling more satisfying than that, because when your mind is actually betraying you constantly, it's quite incredible being able to understand it better and feel that you have some control of it. Anyways, I could go on and on about this book, but I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna read you some of the quotes that I really loved from the book. So the first one that I have is, by far the most frustrating feature of bipolar disorder for me is the fact that my poles often fail to stay put, lacking even the basic courtesy to remain in their respective manic or depressive compartments. Even with the best medical treatment, they're painfully unpredictable. I can never tell when a color on one end of the spectrum will begin to bleed into one on the other, when the aims of my classically goal-oriented manic propensities will direct themselves toward the morbid obsessions of my depressive vulnerabilities. And therein lies my most terrifying neurological deficit. A devil that I know exists, one that I've met before and never wish to meet again, one for which my own mind is unavoidably responsible, and one with the worst timing imaginable. The next one is one that I just really connected to because I've been feeling this a lot recently. Instead of just telling people I was sick, I made up all these more acceptable excuses. Flat tire, stuck in an elevator, imaginary funerals for imaginary friends, someone else in a crisis, someone else is sick, someone else needs me. Anything but the truth. This next one is about sort of how healthcare professionals would treat her. If you have cancer, you get flowers, visitors, and compassion. If you have a mental illness, you get plastic utensils, isolation, and fear. If you survive cancer, most people consider you a hero and an inspiration, and they tell you so. If you survive a mental illness, most people consider you a feeble-minded degenerate and an embarrassment, and they wouldn't dare tell you so. Although they seem to love telling everyone else you might or might not know. It's more juicy gossip than medical misfortune. No one's making a killing selling bipolar survivor wristbands or schizophrenia survivor t-shirts. And then this final quote is one that I think really speaks to how she was aware of her privilege and how many people are much worse off with this disorder. This quote also comes up when she's talking about a really intense manic episode that she was having and when she was about to be hospitalized. To the outside world, I was just another lunatic talking to herself, assaulting mothers and berating babies. To me, I was a spiritual and political prodigy. Today, I see other mentally ill individuals, mostly homeless, on street corners all over the country, and I'm overwhelmed with fear and empathy. Under slightly different circumstances, I could just as easily be them. Before I lost my mind, these people were all but invisible to me. After, I saw them everywhere. I think you can tell from the quotes that this is just a really intense read, and I honestly recommend this to all of you. Please go read it. This was obviously a 5-star read for me. Alrighty, on a much lighter note, the next book that I picked up in July was Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. And guys, I don't know how Ali Hazelwood does it every time, but she does it for me every time. In general, I'm not the biggest romance reader, so I feel like my standards when it comes to romance novels isn't that high, but I do feel like Ali Hazelwood has a way of writing romances that I just really enjoy. I always leave them feeling really good, and I feel like I've always had a great time with them. And although I really loved The Love Hypothesis and Love on the Brain, her previous books, I really loved Love Theoretically, and I think it's probably my favorite of her books. And I think the reason is honestly because this book particularly felt so personal to me. Like, I just felt attacked by Miss Hazelwood because the main character in this book just felt so similar to me, especially in her people-pleasing tendencies and her desire to, you know, make sure that everyone else's needs are taken care of before her own. And this is just something I've been thinking about a lot as I've been going through this sort of healing journey and, you know, figuring out my mental health and just like my own sanity and what I want out of life. I've been realizing that one of the things that's been really harming me is just the fact that I've been prioritizing everyone else above myself. And so our main character is sort of juggling this family who is taking advantage of her and her help. She's got friends and advisors who take advantage of her, and she approaches every situation in the book with like thinking about how she can change herself to fit other people's needs, and she really just erases herself in the situation. And I feel like depending on who you are and how you're coming into this book, you might find the main character a little bit insufferable because she kind of is in some instances, and I understand how I can be insufferable sometimes with my people-pleasing tendencies, but I think that was just so relatable to me, so I just really loved seeing that on the page. One thing I really loved about this book, aside from the main character and like the romance and stuff, was actually the representation of the main character's chronic illness. So she has diabetes, diabetes. And it's mentioned a lot throughout the book how she's dealing with that, how she wants like a proper job with benefits so that she doesn't have to pay for her meds out of pocket. And like these were all just really relatable things that some people just don't have to think about when they don't have a chronic illness. But for me, as someone who does have chronic illness and does have like mental illnesses that need like attention constantly and medication constantly, it just felt so relatable to me just reading this book and seeing her struggle with these things in a way that like I feel like regular people don't have to. And it's just like, it sucks in a way. And it was just nice to see that represented on the page. But of course, I read this book for the romance, not just for all of the other themes. And guys, the romance was just so freaking cute and so great. I really, really loved the setup and the way that it progresses. While I do feel like it got a little bit fast towards the second half of the book, I do feel like I can sort of chalk that up to it just being a novel. I feel like in real life, obviously it wouldn't really go that quickly, but you do need to speed things along for narrative reasons. But the whole like first 2/3 of the book were really fantastic in terms of the romance for me. I loved our main love interest, who is a professor of experimental physics, and he is a bit of a rival for our main character in a lot of ways, and they meet under very unlikely circumstances, and so there's like suspicion between them and just a lot of not really liking each other, and it turns into something so deeply more, and I just enjoyed it so much, honestly. I really love interests who call the main characters out on their bullshit, and the main love interest in this one really did that. He was so good about that, and he was really good about getting her to open up and really show who she was really, and not just try to please him or other people. Like, he wanted her to just be herself, and that was just really nice to see. One of the things that I also really loved about him was just the way that he wanted her to allow him to take care of her. He wanted to be there for her in a way that no one else was being there for her, and I just loved seeing that as well. Anyways, this was just overall really fun, really cute, and just the most relatable romance for me that I've read in a while, and I loved every moment of it. Now, in terms of quotes that I loved from this one, a lot of these are spoken by our male love interest because he just had some words to share. So the first one is, "It's easier like that, isn't it? Never showing anyone who you really are. That way, if something goes wrong, if someone rejects you, then it's not about you, is it? When you're yourself, that's when you're exposed. Vulnerable." This next quote is just so freaking cute and just really speaks to how caring the main love interest is. He says, "In my fantasies, you allow me to keep an eye on you. And when I really let go, I imagine that you let me take care of you too." And she says, "Why?" And he says, "Because in my head, no one has done it before." And then the final quote is just our main character musing about relationships, and this kind of ties into the theme of the book and it being like these two people who are involved in physics. And she says, "But I wonder if certain relationships are living proof of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Their position and their velocity simply cannot both be measured at the same time, not even in theory." I thought that was a really cute quote and just like tied into the themes, and I just love like the little puns and like jokes along the way in the book. So overall, I really enjoyed this one. Definitely think you should check it out if you have enjoyed Ali Hazelwood's previous novels. This was particularly my favorite, and I would give it a 4 stars. And if you're interested, there is an audiobook for this one. I didn't particularly listen to it the whole way through. I just listened to it for certain parts when I didn't have the physical book with me, but it is pretty good as well, so it's up to you to check out. Alright, the next book that I picked up was actually a nonfiction, and this is one that was recommended to me by my sister multiple times, so I thought I would pick it up at last. So that book is Atlas of the Heart, and this is by Brené Brown. So this is my first ever Brené Brown book. I know she's really big in the self-help genre, and I have been recommended some of her other books by other people as well, but this one I decided to just pick up because it essentially goes through the psychology and sort of language of meaning when it comes to our perception of emotions and how we talk about them and how we think about them. It was honestly really interesting because she backs up every sort of claim she makes about emotions and how we talk about them, and you know, the language that we use and the psychology behind it with evidence and data and like actual studies that either she and her team have done or other people have done. So it's just a really interesting and sort of informational read as well. So if you're someone who enjoys self-help books, if you enjoy books about well-being, if you like understanding more about yourself and others, then I think this one's definitely one to pick up. And there were parts of the book that I was reading and I was just like, oh my god, yeah, that's such a good point, and why haven't I thought about this in this way before, and why haven't I tried to approach a problem like this instead of getting all up in my negative emotions. If you are planning to read it, I would highly recommend the audiobook, which is what I listened to because it's narrated by the author Brene Brown herself, and she reads it in this really interesting way that I've never seen done for an audiobook, especially for a nonfiction one like this. And I think it's an approach that really should be taken for all of these nonfiction sort of self-help well-being books, because she essentially like reads the book but doesn't just like treat it as like that's the script and that's it. She'll actually like reread some lines and parts if she really wants you to get like the full focus of what she's trying to say. And she kind of speaks in the audiobook as if it's a podcast, so it really makes it feel like you're just learning something from a conversation with someone rather than reading a book. I feel like generally I learned a lot from the book, and it was just a useful read, especially with all the healing that I've been trying to do and like the therapy that I've been going through. And so if you're someone who is generally a self-reflective person, I highly recommend picking it up. I have several different quotes from this one, so I'm just going to jump right into them. The first one is, "The near enemy of love is attachment. Attachment masquerades as love. It says, I will love this person because I need something from them. Or, I'll love you if you love me back. I'll love you, but only if you will be the way I want. This isn't the fullness of love. Instead, there is attachment. There is clinging and fear. True love allows, honors, and appreciates. Attachment grasps, demands, needs, and aims to possess." The next quote that I have is, "Choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. We have to ask questions, admit to not knowing, risk being told that we shouldn't be asking, and sometimes make discoveries that lead to discomfort." This next quote is one that I really love because I feel like people just throw around the word empathy a lot, but they don't really know what it means. This is one reason we need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes. Rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell about what it's like in your shoes, and believe you even when it doesn't match my experiences. I also really love this next quote because this is something that I have always thought about and I've never been able to put into words. So she goes, "The idea that regret is a fair but tough teacher can really piss people off. No regrets has become synonymous with daring and adventure, but I disagree. The idea of no regrets doesn't mean living with courage. It means living without reflection. To live without regret is to believe we have nothing to learn, no amends to make, and no opportunity to be braver with our lives." And then this final quote really speaks to me as someone who is a people pleaser. So, in a world where perfectionism, pleasing, and proving are used as armor to protect our egos and our feelings, it takes a lot of courage to show up and be all in when we can't control the outcome. It also takes discipline and self-awareness to understand what to share and with whom. Vulnerability is not oversharing. It's sharing with people who have earned the right to hear our stories and our experiences. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. So yeah, overall, this one was just a really valuable read to me. I feel like she had some really incredible insights and truths to tell us. And in terms of a rating, I would give this one 4 stars. And if you're interested in the audiobook, I highly recommend checking it out because it was just so fantastic. Alrighty, on to the next book on this wrap up. I have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. So for those of you who have been following my channel for a while, you know that I actually reviewed this partly a little bit in my January wrap up of this year because I actually started this in December of 2022 and it's taken me 8 months now to finish this book because this was a ride for me, guys. Even at that time, I wasn't really feeling this book. I was struggling with it a lot, and now having actually finished the book and like pushing myself to finish it, because some of you had commented on my video and said that like the ending is what makes the book and that, you know, I'll really maybe love it by the end. So I was like, you know what, I need to finish this. I was just like so sort of stubborn and determined to like eventually get to finishing this one because otherwise I really would have DNF'd this. Now that I have finished the book, I can honestly say that this book was just not for me. I've really loved Roshni Chokshi's previous books. I've loved her YAs, The Star-Touched Queen and The Crown of Wishes, but I've also really loved her series, which was the Gilded Wolves series. And this book, while it was her first adult, I feel like it lacked a lot of the things that I love in adult books, and it really just ended up being a book with lots of vibes and not very much plot, which is exactly the type of book that I don't particularly enjoy. Going into this book and based off the marketing, I went into it thinking it was going to be like this captivating exciting and speculative adult fiction about a marriage and like the complexities of that and sort of framing it in this fairy tale aspect. But what I ended up getting was something that was more about fairy tales and friendship and love, but more in this like amorphous, vague way rather than a really grounded story. And obviously there's like nothing wrong with that, but I think I just went into it with the wrong expectations. The whole book is sort of obsessed with the idea of fairy tales, and like a fairy tale, it's sort of told like a fairy tale. So it's very vague about all the facts. There's no identifying details about anyone. You only know things about the characters in snatches, and you can't really tell if it's like a metaphor in that line or if that's like actually like the truth. And while there's a lot of beautiful language and beautiful lines, there's also this sense of like complete and utter delusion. And so I commend her ability to like turn the whole thing into feeling like a fairy tale, but I think the overall effect just ends up being kind of confusing and dazed in a way that like if you are just trying to figure out what's happening, it's just kind of confusing. I personally felt like the whole book was just not going anywhere for most of the book, and then a bunch of things started happening towards the end, and while I appreciated that at the end, I still didn't feel like it was enough. Like I said, someone had commented on my January wrap up and said that the end would like make it for the book, or that's what made it for them, and I totally get that. But for me, I personally kind of saw the big twist at the end coming, and so when it did eventually come, I was like, okay, yeah, I saw that coming, and it wasn't as like gripping and intense for me as it was for other people. But regardless of all of that, I still feel like this was a valuable read, and I feel like there were some really beautiful lines, so I'm gonna read out some quotes for you. So the first one goes, "This is why fairy tales are dangerous. Their words sneak into your veins and travel into the chambers of your heart, where they whisper of your exceptionalism. They say, ah, but remember the boy who walked into the woods and came out a king? Oh, but what of the girl who was kicked and slept in ashes? Remember the man who is only kind and so life bent around the shape of his smile. But we are not exceptional." And then the next one I have is, "In the end, a fairy tale is nothing more than a sense of hope. Hope lures and tricks. It tempts with shining thrones, exquisite nectars, and loving arms. It whispers to us that we are extraordinary, exempt. Thus lured, we follow its path. Sometimes we are led to riches. Other times we are led astray. But this hope never hides its shape, and for its honesty we reach out for it, pull its sweet and stinking furs up to our chins, for to live without it means living without magic." And then the final quote that I want to read is just a really beautiful freaking line, and it goes, "She looked like nostalgia that settled in your ribs at the end of a story you have never read, yet nevertheless know." So yeah, overall this book just wasn't it for me, but I would rate it around a 2.5 stars. But if you are interested, there is an audiobook for this one. While I felt like it was a bit slow, I do think the narrators were quite good, so up to you to check it out. Alright, and then the final book that I read in July was another collection of short stories, and it's called Sweetlust by Asya Batkic, and this was translated by Jennifer Zobel. So it was originally written in Croatian, I believe, and the author is actually Bosnian. She lives in Croatia, and this is essentially a collection of many short stories. There's not just like a few, there's like I think almost 10, and all of them were just really interesting and all over the place in some ways, but all of them explored many of the same themes. So they talked about sexuality, queerness, and also gender politics in some way. The stories range from contemporary fiction all the way to sci-fi, and they get really weird as they get into the sci-fi bend of things, and there's just like alternate worlds and like alternate ways of being, and it was just all really fascinating to read. And I think the like limitless nature of the author's imagination was just so incredible. Obviously I liked some stories more than others, and the ones at the beginning of the book are a lot more tame, and then as you go through the full collection they get even weirder as you go. But I was just kind of astounded by the sheer number of ways that the author tackled these same themes. One thing I really loved about Sweetlust and the Goth House Experiment is that they center queerness in these stories without much like thought, and it's just like a seamless part of the story. And I feel like that's something that I haven't really seen in books a lot, and something that really frustrates me about reading. A lot of the times I just want a book that like has queerness in it without it being like a thing or like a topic. And obviously these stories don't ignore the difficulties and the challenges of, you know, being queer, but they sort of keep them as part of the full story and you're still exploring other themes. So I really just enjoyed that aspect of this collection and also the Goth House Experiment. I will say though that Sweetlust was really interesting in the element of it exploring sexuality and like sex and gender in such an interesting way, in like a way that sort of blew my mind, I think, because it was just so out of the box and just really sort of graphic in some ways as well. This is definitely an adult story collection, so if you're a child and under 18, please don't read this because there's some really nasty things that are also talked about in this book, but it was just really fascinating to read. But I think the one thing that I loved the most about Sweetlust was just the feminist nature of all of the stories. Like, they all talk about gender politics in a big way, but the way she talked about gender politics was just so interesting. So the quote that I want to highlight from the collection kind of talks about that, and this is actually from the first story in the collection. Why did she lose to men every time? She wandered absently into the field and entered the woods. She walked, contemplating her own gender. How could you beat an opponent if you started the match with half the points already decided in his favor? You play until 21, and the scoreboard says 0 against 11. You haven't even taken your racket out of its case yet, and you're already losing. Overall, this was a really incredible short story collection and one of the most like obscure and random books I've ever picked up, and I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's such an underrated like collection of stories, and I really would love to hear more thoughts on it. I believe it does have an audiobook, but I didn't pick it up. In terms of a rating, I would definitely give this one a 4 stars because it just wowed me incredibly. And with that, those are all the books that I want to talk about for my July wrap up. I feel like I had such a great reading month and I can't wait to read more books like these ones for next month. Definitely let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought of them, as I would love to hear all of your thoughts. And as always, if you want to get more updates on what I'm doing and what I'm reading, go check out my Instagram and TikTok down below, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!